Look a lot more closely now at those sanctions, in fact, that have been imposed on Russia and what effect they might have on the country's economy. Our business editor, Stephen Carroll, is here on set with us to tell us more.
Stuart, US President Joe Biden called these the first tranche of sanctions that could be imposed on Russia as a result of their moves in Ukraine. His announcements came in coordination with similar moves by London, Brussels, and as we've been hearing, other capitals around the world as well. Let's remind ourselves of the key measures that were announced. Russian banks were targeted by the US, UK and the EU, with between 2 and 5 of them being blacklisted by each. There's also an effort to restrict Russian access to financial markets, adding further limits to how much European and American banks can deal in Russian bonds. Then there were measures targeting individuals and the Russian elite with asset freezes and travel bans. So how much will those measures affect the Russian economy? In terms of trade, there were no direct measures targeting Russia's major export of oil and gas. Germany did announce it was suspending the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, but that pipeline isn't in operation yet, so it doesn't have an immediate impact on how much oil and gas Russia is exporting. And if we actually look at what happened to Russia's exports in recent years, when sanctions were imposed in 2014 after the annexation of Crimea, there was a sharp drop in the value of what Russia was exporting every year. But that did stage a recovery as Russia looked for other markets for its products. The pandemic did cause another dip, but we're still talking about exports worth over $330 billion a year. Clear from this chart too that the main export is what we can see on that red line there, minerals, oil, gas and coal. That's the big part of what Russia sells abroad. That's products that aren't affected by these sanctions. And in fact, one US official said any future steps should not disrupt oil and gas flows. That a recognition that European countries are major customers of Russian oil and gas, so their consumers could end up paying much more if that supply was disrupted. Let's look next at the efforts to target Russia's access to financial markets. The sanctions announced will ban American and European banks from dealing in Russian bonds. This is an extension of limits that were first put in place in 2014 and then extended in 2019. It'll make it much more complicated for the Russian government to raise money on the international markets. But since 2014, Moscow has been preparing for this. It's been building up its foreign exchange reserves, thanks again to its sales of oil and gas. And that's given it a cushion, which allows it to have reserves to help support the value of the ruble if that's needed, or to cover government expenses. You can see foreign exchange reserves and their gold reserves too, both rising in recent years. The country has in general improved its finances, so it isn't borrowing as much as it did before either. That means that any increase in borrowing costs as a result of these sanctions will have a lesser impact on the country's bottom line. All of this to say that the ultimate effectiveness of these sanctions remain for the moment quite uncertain. Now, political leaders say this is just the first round of sanctions the West has prepared against Russia. Further restrictions could be, for example, placed on banks, more banks than those have been listed so far. That would have a much greater impact on the country's financial system. Russia could also be excluded from the SWIFT bank transfer system, which would make it very difficult for those lenders to do any business overseas. There could be limits too placed on which goods can be sold to Russia, things like technology exports, which could hurt Russian industry. And the US could ban Russia from financial transactions using US dollars, but that could impact sales of oil and gas. So plenty more options on the table, each though with consequences on other parts of the world as well. Now, news of these sanctions have largely been shrugged off by the markets in trading. The price of oil, which jumped on Tuesday to its highest level in 7 years, settling down today. The international benchmark Brent crude trading under $97 a barrel, as you can see. Yesterday it went as high as $99.50. Still close to the highest level we've seen in 7 years, but as you can see, things much calmer after the big rises that we saw in the price of oil yesterday. On the stock markets, European shares starting the day mostly with small gains, breaking that losing streak of recent days, all linked to the events happening in Ukraine. Car makers are actually among those seeing gains today, among them France's Stellantis, which owns Fiat, Peugeot and Citroën. It's up 4% after their latest results. And on the Asian stock markets, a similar picture. After several days of heavy losses, we've seen things turn positive, particularly on the Chinese markets and on the Kospi in Seoul. Japan's markets closed today, though. It's the Emperor's birthday holiday. Stuart.
I hope he enjoys it. Thank you very much, Stephen.